So what is game theory? Well, game theory is literally just the mathematics of games. And games have some essential features, right? A game like checkers. My success in a game of checkers is going to depend both on what I do and what my opponent does, but vice versa, right? So if you were watching a game of checkers and completely ignoring what your opponent did, you would probably lose really fast because your opponent is going to be adaptively responding to you with the goal of winning. So you need an equation that describes my success based on what I do, and your success based on what you do, and your success based on what you do and what I do. And we need a second equation in reverse. And just in case you think that checkers is a completely trivial example that's meaningless, you can actually publish a paper in the journal Science, which is one of the most prestigious journals in the world, literally doing the mathematics of checkers. This is a cute little paper. Checkers is a funny game because it's sort of a branching decision tree of options. Okay, so then what is evolutionary game theory? Well, you could imagine that evolution or that interactions in nature just take on the essential features of a game, right? You could imagine that plant success depends on their traits, their alleles, but it also depends on the traits and alleles of other organisms in the ecosystem. So here's a picture, again, from a fairly prestigious journal called Trends in Ecology and Evolution, often just called TREE. And it shows you, you probably can't read all of these, but it shows you all of the possible interactions that plants have with things that aren't plants, right? So plants interact through competition and reproduction, but all of these things are things like bacteria and fungi and invertebrates. And I don't want you to know every one of these, but you can take a look at the number of circles on here, and it's 16 or so. There's a lot of types of interactions that plants deal with, from things eating their nectar, things pollinating them, things eating their leaves or their stems or their roots. People probably know about mycorrhiza that associate with plant roots, and we'll talk about all of these things. All of this can be thought of as a game, just like checkers, that the outcome of these interactions is going to depend on the alleles of the plant and the alleles of the thing they're interacting with. So let's give some definitions. I promise you we're getting past the definitions. We're going to define a strategy in the context of a game as an adaptation that influences the interactions of organisms with each other and the environment, right? So strategy is an adaptation. An adaptation is one of those funny words that you can use as a noun or a verb. Here we mean it as a noun. Adaptations are the traits of organisms that are shaped by natural selection, and we already know what natural selection is. It's the differential survival and reproduction due to adaptations. We're going to define fitness as the currency of natural selection, right? It's differential survival and reproduction due to adaptations. I survive better and I reproduce better as a result of my adaptations. Mathematically, this can become a per capita population growth rate, and we're going to talk more about how populations grow and shrink due to these kinds of things, but you could imagine that this is really simple. If I want to predict what the population size is going to be next year, so t+1, all I need to do is know how many individuals there are this year, add the births, subtract the deaths, and boom, that's how many individuals there will be next year, right? So fitness clearly leads to population level changes. Evolution is a population level process. And the key thing in evolutionary game theory is something called the evolutionarily stable strategy, or the ESS. So in the same way that you can say DNA or maybe PCR to a lot of molecular people and they know exactly what you mean, in my world you can say ESS and people know exactly what you mean. So an ESS is the strategy, and it might be multiple strategies, that once they're adopted by the population cannot be invaded by any players that adopt an alternative strategy, and at the same time can invade populations using alternate strategies. So it's this ability to invade and resist invasion is the key to ESS. All right, so just to summarize this idea of evolutionary game theory, strategies are equal to adaptations. Game theory predicts strategies via the ESS concept and the concept of fitness. An ESS is defined based on whether or not it can be invaded. And therefore, we might actually be able to use game theory to predict all ecology and evolution at the same time. We've already talked about heterostyle in the context of disruptive selection, right? And heterostyle is this idea that the male parts and the female parts are different lengths, and it's meant to promote outcrossing. And so this is what I would call a categorical strategy, right? So the idea is you're either this or you're this. There's nothing in between, right? And we saw that with disruptive selection. The things in between are actually actively selected against. So this would be a categorical trait. And you could think about the way we've been graphing things in lab, right? Here's a situation where if you wanted to graph the frequency of these two morphs, you would probably use a bar graph. right? Because this isn't a continuous trait. It's A or it's B. Flower color morphs, I've been using that example too, talking about different colored flowers. So these are P's, just different morphs, right? And actually, any of Mendel's traits, if you've learned sort of Mendelian genetics in any of these classes, can be described as categorical traits, right? So Mendel observed you could have green or yellow pods, you could have inflated or pinched, you could have seed shapes, all that kind of stuff. So these are categorical. So matrix games, which I'm going to teach you how to solve in this class, are the type of game theory we use when you have categorical traits. So if we take this example of heterostyle, right? So we've got this morph has the long male part and the short female part. It's mostly blue. And this has the opposite. It's sort of mostly red. So we've colored the long part blue and the short part red. And so you can imagine that you can create essentially 4 possible worlds and start to think about which of these worlds exists, right? So what we've done is we've created 4 hypothetical worlds. And we've asked which of one of these do we expect to find in nature, and we can do this with the ESS. It's the strategy that can't be invaded by anything alternative. And success in the game comes from fitness as a per capita population growth rate, as births and deaths. So here are 4 possible worlds, right? You can imagine that in a world of all long stamen, so we've got the player and the opponent, right? So you read it this way. This player has this opponent. In a world with only these 2 kinds of things, everybody gets a fitness of A. And A is just some variable. We don't know the number yet, but eventually we could define A as some number. Right? And we can imagine another world where a red guy is playing only against this guy. And if that was the world, then everybody would get a fitness of D. And then in other possible worlds, this guy competes against, we have a mixture, right? C and B describe the worlds where there are mixtures. So this is important. We're going to use matrix games a lot in this class. So rewind the video if you need to, right? We basically have 3 possible outcomes. A world of only these guys where everybody gets a fitness of A. A world of only these guys where everybody gets a fitness of D. And then a mixed world where if you're this guy, you get this. If you're this guy, you get this.